We are going back to basics in this video as we tackle the classic, the legendary, the one and only dungeon tile. I love using miniatures in my roleplay games. I know, you don't necessarily need them, but to be perfectly honest, I kinda do. In my opinion, it's so much easier to convey placement, distances, and the surroundings with visual aids like these. Now, to use miniatures, you need some sort of terrain to place them on, besides the miniatures themselves, of course. For this, you can either go with simple hand-drawn maps, or go completely crazy by using elaborate dungeon sets. One solution that falls somewhat in the middle for me is the classic dungeon tile. At this point you're probably thinking, wait a minute, didn't we cover all this last year? And you're kinda right. Last year I built my Diablo-inspired dungeon set, which I still love to use. I even went so far as to create a fitting cavern set. Though I have to admit, there is a beautiful simplicity in laying down a few tiles and having a small dungeon map ready to go. As a base for my tiles, I use simple MDF squares pre-cut to a size of 9 by 9 centimeters, which translates to roughly 3.5 inches. Consequently, the grid I'll be using on these tiles will be a bit larger than your standard 1-inch grid. In an age where miniatures are getting bigger and bigger, this slightly larger layout is much more easier to handle. Since these squares are already at a perfect size, you don't need any cutting tools or fancy laser machinery, which is a huge plus in my opinion. However, simple MDF tiles don't quite make for dungeon tiles yet. Of course, you could simply draw some texture on them and call it a day, if that's enough for you. I wanted to add at least a bit of actual texture though, so I took my admittedly huge roll of cork and cut small squares out of it. This particular material is 2 mm thick and therefore ideal for adding the illusion of stone tiles. Just make sure to cut their sides a bit smaller than 3 centimeters. These can then be added using common PVA glue from the hardware store. To round everything off, in a pretty much literal sense, I use my wire brush to rough up the cork pieces a bit. This is best done well after everything has dried up, as the goal is not to remove the cork, but to damage it here and there. This results in a much more natural look. At this point I wanted to add a bit more visual interest to the tiles, so I went on a search through my bits collection. Here I looked for old swords, skulls and other skeleton pieces, which I glued directly onto the gaps between the tiles. I also added a few decorative stones to the same areas. Here I intentionally left the surface of the cork free of clutter, so that miniatures could be placed without any problem. Though there is still a bit lacking, especially in the gaps between the cork tiles. Here is where my homemade texture paste comes into play, imparting that crucial final flourish to structures made with cork. Basically, it's just cheap gap filler from the hardware store, mixed with a bit of PVA, water and paint. I applied it over the entire tile and used paper towels to remove the excess on top of the tiles and the bits. Granted, this stage tends to be a tad messy, so wearing gloves is advisable. To ensure that everything stays in place, I added another layer of watered down PVA after the paste was sufficiently dry. And with that, we can finally paint these tiles, exploring not just one, but 4 different color schemes. The first color scheme I wanted to show you is my version of the basic gray tile. It's the ultimate classic dungeon tile scheme, and I'd argue that 9 out of 10 crafters would paint the tiles in a similar style. To achieve this look, I started with a brown primer as a base. I then painted each tile separately using a medium grey. While I used my airbrush for efficiency, it's not necessary. Hand painting each tile could yield slightly better results, as this avoids paint spillage. Next, I painted the edges in 2 lighter grey tones. While dry brushing is an option, I prefer the intentional approach of using a regular brush for this step. Next, I washed it with a diluted desolate brown speed paint. Alternatively, you could mix your own wash with cheap craft paints or perhaps inks, but dilution is necessary either way. After drying, I completed the tile with dry brush grey and sand tones. Finally, I painted the added bits accordingly. Now that we've achieved the classic look, let's shift our attention to more unusual color schemes. The first one I want to show you is inspired by OSR Aesthetics, evoking the nostalgic charm of old Dungeons and Dragons maps. If you're a bit older and have been a long-time D&D player, you'll likely recognize this distinct but simplified look. To emulate this simplicity, I first primed the entire tile with a very saturated blue. Afterwards, I painted each tile separately with white. Here I used a brush to avoid any spillage contaminating the gaps. Additionally, I used the white to highlight the rougher stones and bits. Finally, to round things off, I applied the blue again and dry brushed it over the tiles. Now, if you are in need of fitting miniatures, consider checking out Bestiary Miniatures' latest Kickstarter campaign, Tormentor Cults. Stemming from the first STL collection, these miniatures reintroduce old favorites and introduce 6 new Tormentor heroes. Additionally, the campaign offers supplementary content like a 5e D&D supplement and a custom scenario pack for Forbidden Psalm, which particularly caught my interest. These miniatures, crafted with cutting-edge resin printers, boast high resolution and minimal layer lines. Notably, smaller models feature an ultra-premium flex resin for exceptional flexibility. Whether for games like Mordheim, Mörk Body or Idols of Torment, these cultists are perfect for darker settings. Follow the campaign link down below to see if the Tormentor cults belong on your table. Many thanks for Bestiarium Games for sponsoring, and now let's get back to the rest of the tiles. Of course, no roleplay themed video on this channel would be complete without at least a reference to my favorite RPG, Merk Body. So why not create a tile set representing the stylistic color choices made in this exceptional book? The goal here is to achieve real high contrast tiles, so I began with a black primer. Then I painted the rims of the tiles yellow. For this I used Molotov paints, as I needed that tone to be extremely opaque, which these graffiti paints inherently are. Finally, I used a variety of Posca markers to add a few more highlights capturing that typical Merk Body look. Last but not least is somewhat of a variation on the classic grey scheme, only this time much more colorful. The idea here is to replicate a similar scheme to my Necropolis 28 board build. Following the approach of the grey tiles and inspired by my previous build, I started with brown as my base coat. Then, using my airbrush, I painted each tile separately. First I applied red, then violet, followed by blue, and finally a slightly desaturated yellow. Similar to the initial tiles, I highlighted the edges with 2 lighter tones corresponding to the hue already present on each tile. To add depth and richness, I applied a homemade dark violet wash, essentially a mixture of violet ink with a bit of matte medium water, generously over the tiles. Finishing touches included dry brushing grey and sand tones onto the tiles, and after painting a few additional details, my dungeon tiles were ready for delving. And here are my 4 separate sets of dungeon tiles. Admittedly, you probably would want more of one color to actually use them in a game, but doing things this way gave me a great look on how certain schemes would work out and which ones I should expand on. What do you think? Which ones should I expand on? At this moment I am leaning towards the colorful tiles and maybe the Merk Body ones. Thank you for watching, and a huge thanks for Bestiary Miniatures for sponsoring this video. As mentioned earlier, you can find a link to their Kickstarter campaign down below. Another massive thanks goes out to my patrons on Patreon. You can join them to receive behind the scenes updates and ad-free versions of these videos, which I aim to upload 1 or 2 days earlier. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to subscribe and give it a thumbs up. Sharing and commenting also helps spread the word to more like-minded people. I hope to see you in the next one, and until then, farewell, fellow adventurers.